From the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, this is Nebraska FARMcast. I'm Ryan Evans. As summer unofficially kicks off and fuel prices fluctuate, it's important to understand how transportation factors like diesel prices, animal handling, and trucking industry changes are impacting the beef cattle industry. Elliott Dennis, assistant professor and livestock economist with the Center for Agricultural Profitability here at Nebraska, has a new article up on our website at cap.unl.edu about what's behind the changing costs of cattle transportation in the U.S. He joins me now to discuss what's influencing the price of getting cattle from A to B and what challenges could be ahead for the livestock industry in this area. Thanks for being here again, Elliott.
Yep, thanks for having me, Ryan.
So with the start of summer and more travel on the roadways, consumers are keeping an eye on gas prices, which ultimately impacts the cost of goods. So can you just tell us a little bit about what's happening on the consumer side and then on the diesel side?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of conversation about what's been happening on consumer side, and that really stemmed from last summer. The nominal gas prices for consumers was really reached an all-time high nationally at over $5 a gallon. That's nationally. Obviously, there's variation by location. But then that prices had started to come down and really kind of hit a bottom at the beginning of January. But since then, it started to creep back up. Obviously, summer is a big time when consumers are traveling, both on the personal side and also a lot of vacation travel and business travel happens in summer. And so there's just been a lot of conversation about higher gas prices now, and ultimately if that's going to diminish really the demand for consumers to travel. Similarly, gas prices and diesel prices, they tend to go in the same direction. And we saw at the same time that diesel really peaked up in the beginning of, or in June of last year. And instead of it bottoming out in January, it's just continued to come down. And we're actually at nominal prices for diesel that we had back in 2012, 2013, 2014. So when we talk about the total cost to get goods from A to B, including cattle, at least that cost has come down a little bit. And if we were to consider just the cost of inflation that's been happening over time, it's probably significantly cheaper than it was.
Good point. And yeah, as you mentioned there, diesel obviously does play a large role in the trucking industry, which in turn has that large role in the livestock hauling industry. So what additional factors are impacting livestock hauling?
Yeah, so when we talk about just transporting animals from A to B, there's a lot of factors. There's large literature out there and discussion about how do we get animals from A to B, and this really stemmed back from, when we started do we haul cattle to the feed or we haul the feed to the cattle? And so what we've realized is that when we transport cattle long distances, there can be a lot of adverse animal health impacts. So up to a certain point. We recognize that there's things such as like ensuring proper ventilation, ensuring that there's sufficient sanitation. All these things kind of get factored into what is that cost and ultimately what is the impact on animal performance. And when we think about what we know about livestock hauling, at least publicly, a lot of that has been on the animal side. It's been on what's the impacts on animal performance, what's the impact on animal health. And there's been relatively little, at least publicly available on the research side, that's really shown what do we know about how livestock hauling is priced. There's a lot of private information out there. If you call up firms or a lot of public bidding, you can go and see what that bidding is. But not a lot is known about kind of what the price is for livestock hauling and how it changes over time and within a year.
So you've talked about some issues here. What is the livestock industry then doing to address these, if anything?
Yeah, so the Beef Quality Assurance Transportation Certificate is one way that the beef industry is getting ahead of this. There are similar certifications for transportation and other livestock species as well. But really what this is trying to ensure proper animal handling practices and really training people who haul livestock, in this case, beef cattle, in proper handling techniques to minimize the adverse impacts. And that's something that certification can be easily obtained. Jesse Fulton, who is the beef system educator at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, he does these for feedlots all around Nebraska. He formerly was with NCBA. He has a lot of experience in beef quality assurance. If you're interested and you don't have your certification yet, or your certificate's expiring, and encourage you to reach out to him, and he'll be happy to either do an on-site visit or more broadly just let you know when there's one in your area.
And if you're listening outside of Nebraska, again, you can likely contact your state's extension program, and they often will have a good contact for you for beef quality assurance. So going back to the trucking industry and its pricing, we know a lot about fuel and animal considerations at play, as you mentioned, but is there more that you're watching or that you would like to know that would be beneficial about the trucking industry and its pricing to kind of inform where the industry is going?
Yeah, so as you said, we don't know a lot about that pricing. There are websites out there, there's private companies, there's bids, and really when we talk about producer decision making, we have a decision, right? We can sell cattle either FOB or delivered. Delivered means the feedlot basically pays for the transportation and assumes all the animal health risk and transportation risk, and the cattle have to arrive at the feed yard, at the processing plant. FOB means the meat packing company essentially sends trucks out there, and once the cattle go across the scale at the feed yard, the packing plant owns them, and they assume all that responsibility for transportation, shrink, animal health, all of that. And so on a larger scale, it's about who assumes the liability for the cattle and the risk. On the second are there times when it's too big of a hassle, or for whatever reason that the packing plants are actually willing to pay more for you to deliver the cattle than at certain times of the year. And for people who know how cattle are priced, we know that there's really two primary ways, regardless of the marketing method, that cattle can be sold. It's live or dressed. Dressed is predominant here in Nebraska, but we go a little bit east into Iowa, and live tends to be the primary, and in South Dakota tends to be the primary method of delivering cattle. And so we can use both of these methods, and we can look at publicly reported data through the mandatory price reporting to get what I calculate as the implied trucking cost. And this can be a premium or a discount. We would normally assume that, man, if I'm paying for trucking, I should receive a premium to do that. But what we found is that it's not always the case. At certain times of the year, or definitely week to week, there are differences. And so what we found was that you can calculate this measure, and you can go to the paper to find exactly how we calculate this. But really, that there's significant seasonal variation, and it's changed over the last 10 to 15 years.
And do check out that article on our website again, cap.unl.edu. And going off of that, then what notable trends are there in trucking premiums and discounts that you've seen?
Yeah, so what we see is that the premium on the live, if cattle are being sold on a live weight basis, is actually the lowest in the winter months and highest in the summer months. That's the seasonal variation. It can go from as low as on average over the last 10 years to about $1 per hundredweight to $4 or $5 a hundredweight. When we look at the week-to-week variation, that's much larger. What I just talked about was just the monthly variation there, but definitely week-to-week, that can be as large as $10 or $15 a hundredweight. And so when we think about the value of that, it's not inconsequential, right? When we think about 1,500 pounds and we're paying it at maybe $5 more a hundredweight for trucking, then we can back calculate how much should we be paying for if we're going to set up the trucking ourselves. And then when we talk about where these trends have changed over time, what we see is that what the value of trucking to be delivered has really changed, and it's gone up. Or in other words, that packers are more willing to pay you to deliver cattle by yourself than to pick up cattle. And that's only the case for live. Over the last 2 years, what we've seen is that prices continue to rise, or the premium to deliver cattle for live weight has gone up, Whereas if we deliver them on a carcass level basis, it's actually decreased. They've diverged completely. And it's the first time that we've actually seen this in the last 20 years. And so that is going to provide a lot of economic incentives in the way that we actually deliver cattle.
You touched on some interesting things too toward the end of your article, just kind of about the labor supply, the human element in this too, that might be impacting prices, just in terms of getting the people to do the actual driving, right? So how is that playing into things?
Yeah, so there's, when we think about the livestock hauling industry and just really the transportation industry in general over the last 5 years, there's been some pretty significant impacts. The first is just there's not people out there who want to do trucking, And if we take the subset of people who actually want to be truckers, there's a growing population that want to be home at night. They don't want to do the long hauls. So they want to, drop a load off and be home at night. And so just those constraints are going to raise the cost of transportation, just because we can't find them, and kind of the hassle to get the people who want to work in those jobs. That has a big impact on what we're willing to pay for that transportation. So some of that premium could be processing plants saying, I don't want to deal with that. You set it up. And if you can deliver it, that's fine. Some of the larger companies, they own their own trucking companies because they'll deliver on the boxed beef side. And so they can use that and leverage those economies of scale to deliver on the cattle transportation side. And probably the largest one has the potential to change and really impact is the electronic log. This really came out in 2017, and agriculture was really given an exemption for short hauls, and because it tends to be pretty seasonal. We're doing a lot of trucking at certain times. Think of like harvest or planting.
So the electronic log, that's basically where drivers are being monitored as far as how long they're on the road, and there are limits, right?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So normally it varies, but essentially the regulation is that you can only drive so many hours and then you have to stop. And this really came about because there were accidents on the road, drivers falling asleep, and really some of it was on the protection of the driver's side, because companies were now taking advantage of them, pushing them to drive harder, longer, farther. So there was benefits for both sides. But ultimately, when we think about if you have 8 hours a day, assuming everything goes well, that's a 4-hour trip one way and a 4-hour trip back. Right now, agriculture has an exemption, but places like Canada and even in Texas, those exemptions are going away. And so agriculture is being subjected to those electronic log requirements. And so that would have a large impact if we're talking about the long hauls, taking cattle from Alabama all the way to Nebraska. That would have a large impact on the cost of delivering cattle, and ultimately the availability of people who want to do those jobs.
Great. Well, great information from Elliott Dennis, assistant professor and livestock economist here in the Department of Agricultural Economics at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln with the Center for Ag Profitability. Again, do make sure you check out his article on this at cap.unl.edu, where you can dive into more about what we've been talking about here and the cost of cattle transportation. So, Elliott, thanks very much.
Yep, thanks for having me, Ryan.
Nebraska FARMcast is a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. For the latest research-based information and education resources to manage your farm or ranch operation, visit our website at cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu.